A ghost visited the skies above Athens on the morning of August 14, 2005. 10 kilometers above the city, a passenger plane circled in complete radio silence. Nobody had spoken to the plane in over 2 hours. Fearing a terrorist attack on the city, the Greek military sent fighter jets to intercept the aircraft. The jet pilots reported nothing but stillness inside the plane, with the exception of one non-pilot who was moving inside the cockpit. The plane then banked to one side and began its descent towards the ground. Minutes later, it crashed in the hills just north of Athens, killing all 121 passengers and crew. What could have caused such an unusual chain of events, and were similar incidents likely to occur in the future? On the early morning of August 14, 2005, 115 passengers and 6 crew members boarded a Helios 522 at Larnaca Airport, Cyprus. Their destination was Prague, Czech Republic, with a stopover in Athens, Greece. It was the summer travel season in Europe, and the majority of the passengers were holidaymakers from Cyprus who would disembark in Athens. The pilot of the flight had a wealth of experience. At 59 years old, he had nearly 17,000 flying hours on his record. The first officer on the flight was 51 years old and had over 7,500 hours of flying experience. Many aircraft shows highlight the experience and professionalism of the crews involved in these accidents, but things were different on this flight. These 2 pilots had flown together on numerous occasions, and the first officer had frequently complained to family and friends about the captain's controlling and authoritarian attitude. The airline had also received notification of this issue. The first officer, for his part, had a checker training record, with numerous training and check pilots mentioning his difficulties with checklists and procedures. This would later prove crucial. We operated this flight on a 7-year-old Boeing 737-300. The 737 is the best-selling passenger jet in the sky, and airlines prefer it for its dependability and cost-effectiveness. The aircraft took off into the early morning sky above the Mediterranean Sea, with all indications being normal. When they reached 10,000 feet, the crew contacted air traffic control in Nicosia, and the captain requested a cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. Air traffic control approved this, allowing the aircraft to continue its climb. An alarm sounded as the plane passed through 12,000 feet. This alarm confused the crew because it usually sounded on the ground when the aircraft was not properly configured for takeoff. The crew didn't understand why they were hearing it in the air. 90 seconds after it began, the captain contacted Helios Operations Center and reported the takeoff configuration warning alarm. The captain also mentioned turning off the ventilation and cooling fan lights and inquired about the location of the circuit breakers. The ground engineer on the other end of the line informed the captain that they were located behind the captain's seat, and they should have turned off the lights anyway. Confused, the engineer asked the captain to confirm the issue, to which the captain responded that the lights were not off. This message made no sense to the engineer. Something immediately came to mind. Prior to the flight, that engineer had worked on the aircraft, testing the pressurization system. This system's instruments are very similar to those mentioned by the captain in his confusing reports. The engineer requested that the captain confirm that the pressurization mode selector was in the auto position. Rather than responding, the captain simply asked where the equipment cooling circuit breakers were. Again, the engineer responded that they were behind the captain's seat. During this conversation, the passenger's oxygen mask decreased. Shortly after, Helios ground operations dispatch called the flight crew, but there was no answer. The aircraft leveled off at 34,000 feet, and no subsequent attempts to contact it were successful. Helios operations called Nicosia Air Traffic Control and requested that the controller contact the flight. For 4 minutes, the controller attempted to contact the flight but received no response. The controller then asked another aircraft if they could contact the plane, but they, too, were unable to. The aircraft entered Greek airspace without first contacting Athens air traffic control and continued on its intended route. Just in case, Nicosia Air Traffic Control contacted the plane via an emergency frequency but received no response. The controller contacted Athens Control and asked if Heidel had called them. The Athens controller replied, "Not yet." The Athens controller issued the aircraft a center clearance, recognizing that the aircraft could simply be having transmission issues on the radio. The aircraft gave no response and made no attempt to descend. The emergency frequency and other nearby aircraft were the targets of more than 20 additional unsuccessful attempts to contact the aircraft. At 7:15, Athens Air Traffic Control contacted the Greek Air Force, which dispatched 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept the aircraft. By this point, the plane had flown on autopilot all the way to Athens Airport and along the Mr. Protrude at 34,000 feet. At 7:37 a.m., the plane entered the KEA holding pattern via war. The fighter jets intercepted the plane in its 6th holding pattern. At 7:30 a.m., the pilot of one of the F-16s reported a vacant captain's seat and someone slumped over the controls in the first officer's seat. They also reported that passengers were sitting motionless in the passenger cabin with oxygen masks covering their faces. The cabin's interior was dark, but they could see the silhouettes of oxygen hoses and masks against the sunlight shining in through the windows on the other side. While the plane was in its 10th round of the holding pattern, one of the F-16 pilots noticed a person in a light blue shirt and a dark vest enter the cockpit and sit in the captain's seat. This person put on headphones and appeared to rest his hands on the panel directly in front of them. The left engine flamed out seconds later. The aircraft secretly turns to the left and begins to descend. The F-16 pilot attempted to attract the attention of the captain, but was unsuccessful. The F-16s kept a safe distance as the plane continued its descending left-hand turn. When the 737 reached approximately 7,000 feet, the person in the captain's seat acknowledged the presence of the F-16s with a hand motion. The F-16 pilot responded with a hand signal, instructing the person to follow him down towards the airport. The person in the captain's seat pointed downward, but he did not follow the F-16. Just before 9 a.m., the aircraft turned left to head southwest, and its right engine failed. The aircraft continued to descend rapidly, colliding with the hills just northwest of Athens about 4 minutes later. The impact destroyed the aircraft, killing all 115 passengers and 6 crew members. Investigators began work immediately following the accident. In addition to examining the wreckage, they interviewed the engineers who had worked on the aircraft in the previous days and weeks. I mentioned earlier in this episode that the pilots on this flight had a checkered record. What I didn't mention was that the aircraft's record was not exactly spotless. The plane experienced a rapid decompression at 35,000 feet on its way from Warsaw, Poland, to Larnaca a few days before Christmas the previous year. The air was breathable, and we landed in Larnaca. This resulted in a thorough inspection of the aircraft, following which a ground engineer adjusted the after right-hand service door. He pressure tested the aircraft and determined it was safe to fly. Then, months later, on the day before it crashed, the aircraft experienced another pressurization issue, this time involving the aft service door. This is an excerpt from the accident report. The Helios Airways Boeing 737-300, Cyprus registration 5BDBY, departed London Heathrow, United Kingdom, for Larnaca, Cyprus, at 9 p.m. on August 13, 2005, prior to the accident. The aircraft landed in Larnaca at 1:25 a.m. on August 14, 2005. During the flight, the cabin crew discovered an issue with the right aft service door. The cabin crew recorded in the defect log of the aircraft that the seal around the aft service door freezes, resulting in loud bangs during flight. The flight crew transferred the cabin crew's concern to the aircraft's technical log, recognizing the need for a comprehensive inspection of the aft service door. This is related to the ground engineer's conversation with the captain as the plane climbed out over the Mediterranean. The ground engineer tested the aircraft's pressurization the night before the accident. We will set the overhead panel's pressurization mode selector to manual as part of this test. Investigators determined that when the engineer finished performing this test, he forgot to return the switch to the auto position. Passenger planes fly at altitudes where the air is too thin to support life. One way around this is to keep the air inside the plane at a higher pressure than the air outside. While the plane may be flying at 34,000 feet, its pressure inside is closer to 8,000 feet. When the pressurization mode selector is in the manual position, no pressurization occurs, and the pressure inside the cabin is nearly equal to that outside. For humans, exposure to this thin air causes a condition known as hypoxia, or low oxygen levels in the body's tissues. The first organ to suffer is the brain, exhibiting initial symptoms like confusion, difficulty concentrating, poor performance on novel tasks, and ultimately leading to unconsciousness and death. Failure to return the switch to automatic mode was the engineer's mistake, but it wasn't fatal. The pilot's pre-flight duties on the morning of the flight included inspecting the equipment cooling switches, the cabin pressurization panel, and the flight crew oxygen masks, among other things. Furthermore, because this was the aircraft's first flight of the day, the pilots were expected to be extra vigilant during these pre-flight duties in case switches or dials had been changed from their normal positions overnight. As it turned out, the pilots had overlooked the position of the switch during their pre-flight procedure. Redundancy ensures aviation safety, so the engineers and the first officer's lapses in vigilance should not have been enough to bring the plane down. The pressurization mode selector was to be checked twice more. Once during the before taxi checklist, which is an oral checklist performed before the plane pushes back from the gate, and again as part of the after takeoff check. Therefore, the pilots had 3 opportunities to detect that the pressurization mode selector was in manual mode. They squandered each of these opportunities. The pilots had another chance to notice the problem as they approached 12,000 feet, and the cabin altitude warning sounded. When this occurred, the pilots disengaged the autopilot and autothrottles before reducing the engine throttle, according to the flight data recorders. It's reasonable to assume the warning was the takeoff configuration warning since a pilot would do this on the runway. The Helios dispatcher confirmed this, noting that when the captain contacted him, he reported that the takeoff configuration alarm had sounded. The Accident Investigation Board concluded that this confusion occurred because, over the course of his or her career, the pilot was most likely to hear this alarm when it referred to a takeoff configuration error and never when it was about cabin altitude. In fact, pilots would hear this warning several times per day while testing its ability to detect incorrect takeoff configurations. In previous decades, dozens of similar incidents had occurred, with pilots hearing this alarm during climb-out and mistaking it for the takeoff configuration warning. Other factors, such as flight attendants notifying the pilots of the situation in the cabin, typically resulted in a more positive outcome than in this case. The Air Accident Investigation Board also suggested that the pilots may have relied on an automatic reaction, such as reducing engine thrust, due to the stress of a serious alarm sounding at an unexpected stage of the flight, instead of first attempting to troubleshoot the problem. Another opportunity to identify the problem arose. When this occurred, another light on the overhead panel illuminated, indicating passenger on or passenger oxygen on. This additional warning light went unnoticed, and investigators were unable to determine whether this was due to the flight crew's early symptoms of hypoxia. One of hypoxia's ironies is that its presence is precisely what makes it difficult to detect. Investigators found that the pilots never thought that they might be having a pressurization problem because they were too focused on the equipment cooling system, the stress from the warning alarms, and not managing the crew's resources well. They were also short on oxygen, which made it hard for them to think clearly. 6 minutes after the captain's initial contact with the Helios Operations Center, and as the aircraft passed through 28,900 feet, communications from the aircraft stopped. The air pressure inside the plane continued to drop, and both pilots became unconscious. After this, The passengers would have been fully conscious for a few minutes, as their masks provide approximately 15 minutes of oxygen. The question remains, who was the mystery person seen in the cockpit when the plane flew over Athens? The cockpit voice recorder's data only showed the last 30 minutes of the flight, but it did show that at least one cabin crew member remained conscious throughout the flight and entered the flight deck more than 2 hours after takeoff. Investigators concluded that in order for the flight attendant to move forward in the aircraft and reach the flight deck, he must have used the portable oxygen bottle. In fact, the wreckage revealed the use of 3 of the 4 portable oxygen cylinders. The investigation board was perplexed by the fact that the captain attendant may not have attempted to enter the flight deck until hours after the first indication that the aircraft was in an abnormal situation. Of course, without a long-serving cockpit voice recorder, it is impossible to determine whether this or any other cabin crew member attempted or succeeded in entering the flight deck. Listening to the cockpit voice recording, colleagues identified this man as Andreas Prajormu, a 25-year-old Helios flight attendant. Prajormu held a commercial pilot's license in addition to his flight attendant certification. However, he lacked the qualifications to fly the 737 or anything larger than a small propeller aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder revealed that Prajormu made several mayday calls after the first engine failed, but he did not press the transmit button during these calls, possibly due to stress or hypoxia. Regardless, the chances of survival were slim. While the aircraft was still within flying distance of Athens airport when Prajormu entered the cockpit, the investigation board determined that his flying experience was insufficient for him to gain control of the aircraft and land it, especially given the extreme stress he would have been under, as well as the possibility of hypoxia. Even if he had successfully landed the plane in Athens, no other passengers or crew members would have survived. They had exposed their brains to a hypoxic environment for 2.5 hours, causing irreversible brain damage. The moment the pilots lost consciousness, everyone on board faced certain doom. In response to this accident and dozens of similar close calls in the years preceding it, the final report made a number of safety recommendations, ensuring that this crash was the last of its kind. The safety board recommended that Boeing prioritize flight crew training and awareness in relation to A, the importance of verifying the bleed and existing configuration after takeoff, and B, understanding and recognizing the differences between cabin altitude and takeoff configuration warnings. The safety board also recommended that Boeing elucidate the maintenance procedure for the cabin pressure leakage test and incorporate a clear directive to switch the pressure mode selector to the auto position after the test concludes. They also recommended that Boeing rethink the design of the cabin pressure control system controls and indicators to enhance their ability to draw and hold the attention of the flight crew during the manual pressurization mode selector setting. Only the green manual light illuminated at the time of the crash. They also recommended that all airlines change their cabin crew procedures so that when an oxygen mask deploys in the cabin due to insufficient cabin pressure and the aircraft does not level off or start at descent, the cabin crew members closest to the flight deck must immediately notify the flight crew of the oxygen mask deployment and confirm that the flight crew has done their oxygen masks. They also recommended that aircraft manufacturers install a visual and/or oral warning alert on newly manufactured aircraft and retrofit older aircraft when the cabin altitude exceeds 10,000 feet. Finally, the board recommended making practical hypoxia training mandatory for flight and cabin crew training. The airline industry gradually implemented these recommendations, leading to a significant reduction in pressurization-related problems on passenger aircraft since the crash of the ELS 522. Since this accident, no passenger jet has crashed for similar reasons.